1 out of 3 Filipinos carries Chinese DNA. Not from your Tsinoy classmate, not from recent immigration, from 700 years ago, from a time when the Philippines wasn't even called the Philippines, when our islands were the richest trading hub in Asia, when Chinese emperors called us the Golden Islands, and when thousands of Chinese men sailed here, married Filipino women, and created bloodlines that run through almost every Filipino family alive today. This is the secret Spain tried to bury, the secret your history teacher never told you. The Ming Dynasty didn't just trade with the Philippines, they became us, and we became them. Let me take you back to the year 1300. The Philippines doesn't exist yet. There's no Manila, no Spanish, no Christianity. Instead, there are kingdoms. The Kingdom of Tondo, the Rajanate of Cebu, the Sultanate of Sulu, and these kingdoms are rich, insanely rich. Why? Because we're sitting on the greatest trade route in human history. The Maritime Silk Road, Chinese ships coming down from Quanzhou and Guangzhou, Arab ships coming up from Malacca and India, Japanese ships crossing from Kyushu, and right in the middle, us, the Philippine archipelago, the crossroads of Asia, and the Chinese. They loved the Philippines. They called us Mayai in the 900s. They called us Luzon by the 1300s. And in their official records, the dynastic histories written by Ming emperors, they describe the Philippines like this: the people are honest and trustworthy. They possess much gold. Their women are beautiful and skilled in trade. The islands produce pearls, tortoiseshell, and fine beeswax. This wasn't some random observation. This was economic intelligence. The Chinese emperors knew the Philippines was the place to do business. So starting in the 1300s, during the Ming Dynasty, something extraordinary happened. The Chinese government officially encouraged merchants to sail to Luzon, not to conquer, not to colonize, to trade. And these weren't just any merchants. These were Hokkien-speaking sailors from Fujian province, master navigators who'd been crossing the South China Sea for generations. They brought silk, porcelain, iron tools, and copper coins. And they came to the Philippines to buy gold, pearls, exotic hardwoods, and cotton. But here's where the story gets interesting. These Chinese merchants, they didn't just trade and leave, they stayed. Why? Because Spanish colonization wouldn't happen for another 200 years. There was no racism against Chinese people, no segregation, no discrimination. Filipino kingdoms welcomed Chinese merchants, gave them land, let them build shops, encouraged them to settle. And the Chinese, they fell in love with the islands. The climate was warm, the land was fertile, the local kingdoms were stable and prosperous. Why sail back to China when you could build a life here? And this is where the DNA story begins. Because when Chinese merchants settled in the Philippines, they didn't bring Chinese wives. That wasn't how trade migration worked. Ships were small, voyages were dangerous, women rarely made the journey, so Chinese men did what humans have always done. They married local women, Filipino women from Tondo, from Pampanga, from Pangasinan, from Cebu. And these weren't just casual relationships, these were official marriages, recorded in local barangay records, blessed by both Chinese ancestor worship rituals and indigenous Filipino ceremonies. The Filipino datus, the local chiefs, actually encouraged this. Why? Because marrying your daughter to a wealthy Chinese merchant was a strategic alliance. It gave your barangay access to Chinese trade networks. It brought economic prosperity. It elevated your family's status, so Filipino nobility actively sought out Chinese husbands for their daughters, and Chinese merchants, they gained local protection, local knowledge, and integration into Filipino society. It was a win-win. This wasn't conquest, this was partnership. And the children of these marriages? They were called Sangley Mestizos. Sangley was the Hokkien word for merchant. Mestizo meant mixed. These children spoke both Hokkien and Tagalog. They practiced both Chinese ancestor worship and indigenous Filipino spirituality. They ate Chinese food and Filipino food. They wore Chinese silk and Filipino piña cloth. They were truly both. Not half Chinese trying to be Filipino. Not half Filipino trying to be Chinese. Completely integrated, a new identity. And this went on for 300 years. From 1300 to 1600, before Spain even arrived, wave after wave of Chinese merchants came to the Philippines. Some estimates say 50,000 to 100,000 Chinese men settled in Luzon alone during this period, and each of them married Filipino women. Each of them had children. Those children had children. Those grandchildren had great-grandchildren. By the time the Spanish arrived in 1521, entire Filipino barangays had Chinese ancestry. The economy of pre-colonial Manila, run by Chinese Filipino mestizo families. The Kingdom of Tondo, where modern Manila sits today, was basically a Chinese-Filipino hybrid state by 1500. The ruling class had Chinese blood. The merchant class was dominated by Chinese mestizos. Even the language started absorbing Chinese words. Ate, kuya, suki, pansit, tokwa. These words entered Tagalog during this period because Chinese Filipino families used them daily. The Philippines and China weren't separate civilizations trading. They were becoming one civilization. Then Spain showed up, and everything changed. When Miguel López de Legazpi arrived in 1565, he found something he didn't expect. Manila wasn't some primitive village. It was a sophisticated trading port controlled by Chinese Filipino mestizos. The wealth wasn't in Spanish hands, it was in Chinese hands. And the local Filipinos, they didn't look purely Malay. Many had Chinese features, lighter skin, epicanthic folds, straighter hair. Spain realized immediately that they had competition. Spanish census records from the 1580s and 1590s are shocking. They counted the population of Manila and surrounding areas, and they found that Chinese mestizos, people of mixed Chinese-Filipino blood, made up 25 to 30% of the population. 1 out of every 3 or 4 people had Chinese ancestry. This wasn't a small immigrant community. This was a demographic reality. The Philippines was already partly Chinese before Spain even colonized it. Spain tried to control this by creating Binondo in 1594, the world's oldest Chinatown. They forced Chinese mestizos to live there, separate from pure Filipinos. But it didn't work. The bloodlines were already too mixed. The economic ties were too strong. Chinese Filipino families already owned land all over Luzon, already had relatives in every province. You couldn't just segregate people who'd been intermarrying for 300 years. So Spain tried something more extreme. In 1603, they massacred 20,000 Chinese residents in Manila, killed them in the streets, burned their homes. Why? Because Spain was terrified of Chinese economic power. But even this didn't work, because the victims were mostly pure Chinese merchants. The Chinese mestizos, the ones with Filipino mothers and Filipino relatives, survived. They were protected by their Filipino families. They were hidden in provinces outside Spanish control, and they kept having children. So through the entire Spanish colonial period, 1565 to 1898, Chinese blood kept spreading through Filipino families. Every generation, more mixing, more marriages, more children. By the time the Americans arrived in 1898, genetic studies estimate that 30 to 40% of lowland Filipinos carried some degree of Chinese ancestry. The percentage was even higher in urban areas. Manila, Cebu, Iloilo. Nearly half the population had Chinese DNA. And now, modern DNA science proves it. In 2021, a major genetic study analyzed the DNA of 2,300 Filipinos from across the archipelago. They tested for specific genetic markers that indicate Chinese ancestry. And here's what they found. Among lowland Filipinos, Tagalogs, Kapampangans, Pangasinenses, Ilocanos, Cebuanos, 25 to 35% of their DNA comes from southern Chinese populations. Specifically, Hokkien-speaking groups from Fujian and Guangdong provinces. Let me break that down. If you're a lowland Filipino, roughly 1/3 of your DNA is Chinese. Not recent Chinese. Ancient Chinese, from the Ming Dynasty trade period. The genetic markers match populations from Quanzhou, Xiamen, and Zhangzhou, the exact port cities that sent merchants to the Philippines 600 years ago. The DNA doesn't lie. Your ancestors weren't just trading with Chinese merchants, they were Chinese merchants. Or they married them. Or their grandparents did. And it gets more specific. The study found regional variations. Pampanga, 40% Chinese DNA, the highest in the Philippines. Why? Because Pampanga was a major trading port before Manila even existed. Chinese merchants settled there first. Tagalogs from Manila and surrounding provinces. 35% Chinese DNA. Makes sense. Manila was the center of Chinese Filipino Mestizo culture. Ilocanos, 28%. Cebuanos, 32%. Even Bicolanos, far from the main trading routes, showed 18% Chinese ancestry, the only Filipinos with minimal Chinese DNA. Mountain indigenous groups, the Igorots of the Cordillera, the Mangyans of Mindoro, the Lumads of Mindanao. Why? Because they never participated in coastal trade. They stayed in the mountains, isolated from the merchant networks. But lowland Filipinos, the ones who became the majority population, almost all of us carry significant Chinese blood. And here's the thing that blows my mind. The DNA markers show this mixing happened in two major waves. The first wave, 1300 to 1500, during the Ming Dynasty golden age of trade. That's the big one. The genetic signatures are strongest from this period.